everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Creator Consult, a podcast produced by Scruffy Chandelier Productions, dedicated to the specific crafts and lives behind all creators. From what are your creative pursuits, to what drives you, and how do you improve your craft? This episode is another installment in our mini-series exploring some behind-the-scenes context in the making of the YouTube short series SCP D-Classified on the Morbid Memories YouTube channel. I'm your host, Ryan Murphy, the writer, director, co-producer, videographer, and editor for the web series, and joining me today, once again, is my co-host and series co-producer, Faaiz Saad, who you will recognize in his starring role as Omar Minhaj in SCP Declassified. Faaiz, welcome to the podcast again.
Thank you, and thank you for that splendid introduction.
You know, trying to let everybody have an entry point if they don't care to listen to the other episodes, if they just want to know the behind the scenes for one. I want to give them that solid intro for each episode. So we are getting into this series now. We are on episode 3, talking about episode 3 of SCP Declassified, called The Girl with the Polaroid. Production for this episode took place on July 19th, 21st, and 27th of 2019. Of course, our source material for this episode is the original article SCP-105, Iris, written by the Deadly Moose, Dan Tenson, and Dr. Clef on the SCP Wiki, also inspired in part by the article Immediate Actions by Dr. Everett Mann, also on the SCP Wiki. So obviously, from the title of this episode, The Girl with the Polaroid, we are of course talking about the famous SCP-105 Iris, and incorporating her into the series, an SCP that is so well known, that is so beloved by a lot of fans. This was kind of a daunting task, I think, for both of us. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I agree, because I remember he spent a lot of time worried about, like, we need to write this right, because if we say something wrong, or if someone, like, oh, that's not canon, you know, we're going to have a bunch of angry people in the YouTube comment section.
For sure. And, you know, it's kind of one of those funny things, because we mentioned in an earlier episode that even though SCP doesn't have accepted canon, that you can do anything you want within the universe, and there is no one canon that you have to follow.
Right.
When you are working with characters like Iris that are so widely known, and there are so many kind of tangential SCP fans that this may be one of the only SCPs that they know.
Right.
Everybody has their own ideas of what they want this character to be, and there is kind of this crowd perspective on the famous articles about this SCP are considered in their way kind of a canon, and even within the rules of the society, which are essentially no rules that you can do whatever you want, if you do stray from that in some of these bigger SCPs, you tend to get some backlash for that.
Yeah, no, people definitely let you know that they are not happy.
For sure. No, and it's funny to go along with that. One of the things that I hadn't expected with Iris that we were getting a lot of comments on, a lot of viewers were really upset about how we portrayed Iris specifically with her age.
Yeah, that was a point of contention because we talked about it for a while, because the original file, she's what, 15, 16?
In the original SCP file itself, they actually don't list her age. It's either, I can't remember, it's either not written or it's redacted in the file, but there are some other source materials that are pretty widely accepted that list Iris as being aged 15 or 16 around the time that she comes to the Foundation. And it's funny because in the setting that we have Iris in this context, all of the stories that are most widely known about Iris, we are intentionally putting in the context that they have occurred pretty far in the past.
Yeah.
That by this point that you're seeing her in SCP Declassified, she's kind of a seasoned Foundation veteran, that she has been here for probably the better part of a decade.
Right.
And so we were really looking at having her in her mid-20s, which is why we cast Peyton for this role. And it was surprising to me how many people were upset about that, given the context that, you know, there's nothing in Iris's file that says that she doesn't age. So in going down the path of her life, this would be a point where she was a bit older.
Right. No, I agree with that. People still won't agree with that, though, but hopefully we can try to put the case to rest right here. However old you think Iris is at 10 years, and that's what we're going for.
No, for sure. And of course, you know, if you have your own ideas about Iris, if you have your own headcanon, that's perfectly valid. You can stick with that, and that's fine. But I think one of the things just kind of odd for us is when we have people saying that we did it wrong.
Right.
When it's in our own canon of our own series. And ultimately, what you want to believe about these fictional characters is totally your prerogative, and you do what works for you, and you believe in this fictional world what you want to believe. And if this doesn't fit with your headcanon, that's totally fine as well. We just, wanted to work it into our show in a way where we're showing Iris as more of a seasoned veteran, as somebody who has grown from the girl that initially came into Foundation custody as now a grown woman who has had to deal with all of these hardships and kind of has a darker perspective on what she's had to go through. That was just something I hadn't really expected to get so many comments about at the time. One of the things that I was most worried about in writing this episode and in putting this out was I was really worried people were, for lack of a better way to put it, I was worried that people were going to get bored with how dialogue heavy this is. We do spend a lot of time rehashing Iris's history just through dialogue to make this accessible to individuals that maybe aren't fans of SCP before they come into this, to give them context and also to give some kind of fun callbacks to fans that are seasoned veterans. We felt like this was important, but I just worried how dialogue heavy it was.
Right. And I remember when we were making the series, like how this has to appeal to two different populations. It has to appeal to the SCP fans, but also the people who aren't in, who don't know who this is, I think it was important to, rehash Iris' history and have such a dialogue-heavy episode, because the previous episode, episode 2, was made specifically for the people who don't know what SCP is. And episode 3 is bringing it back to those hardcore fans who are like, we know you've been waiting, so here, let's give you some really big dialogue-heavy stuff. You can learn about Iris more, and then we can even give you a visual representation, because I haven't seen or heard anything close to what we've done showing Iris' boyfriend's death.
Right. No, and that's a good point to bring up. And, obviously I haven't watched all the SCP content out there. I wouldn't be surprised, especially if one of the animation channels kind of took that onto their mantle to do a short animated tale about it. But no, I had not seen that either. And it's funny that you bring that up too, because with that flash into the past with showing her boyfriend's death, we actually had planned with her talking at the point where she is speaking about Incident R1300 Site 17. We had actually planned a whole sequence that we were going to show that series of events unfolding. We actually had somebody in mind that we had wanted to play Ferdinand.
Right.
And we were talking about doing some practical effects to show Ferdinand being larger than some of the guards and going in depth into that tale and really showing it rather than just having her say that.
Right.
But as I'm sure you'll recall, we had to have some difficult discussions back when we were looking at our schedule and planning to film this, that the production timeline that we had available to us wasn't adequate to shoot everything that we had planned to shoot. And so there were some scenes like that one that just had to hit the cutting room floor that ultimately we deemed were not important enough to share the vision that we had for the project.
And I also think another concern was like, whatever we did on the series, we wanted to look good. We wanted to look as good as we could possibly make it. And with a scene like this, we just sort of accepted the fact that like, we can try doing everything we can and we can make the scene happen if we really wanted to, but is it going to look good or just going to look like crap and bring down the entire production value? And in the end, that was another big consideration for us when we were cutting it out.
One of the other big limitations to shooting that scene would have been we would have needed at least 10 guards to play dead in the hallways and to be animated and fall down and die.
Right.
And unfortunately, just with the nature of the low budget of this production and the resources that we had, we realized that just wasn't going to be feasible.
Right. Absolutely.
One last point on the dialogue train that I want to give a shout out. Faaiz, you actually helped this episode out a lot in that department, because I remember when I was writing the script for this episode, I got into some parts where I think I was writing the meat of this episode. I was kind of pushed up against the deadline we had set for ourselves, and I was writing a lot of it really late at night.
Yeah.
And I got to the point where the conversation started to revisit points that we had already talked about, and I got a bit cyclical. And I think when you went through and you edited it and you made suggestions, I think we cut down, wasn't it close to 2 pages of dialogue?
There was a lot that was just redundant. And I think it's just because you were sleeping maybe 4 or 5 hours between all the work you had and school and everything. You just had a lot at once. So I do not blame you at all for that.
Yeah, no, it was a packed schedule. And this script was definitely one that the initial draft, it showed the amount of sleep I was getting. So I definitely appreciate Faiz's perspective in bringing in the edits to the script and really shaping this one down to the point that I think the dialogue was a manageable length. and we said everything that we needed to say without being redundant.
Right. No, I agree with that.
I think with kind of getting to this point where I feel like we've talked a lot about the scripting and the behind the scenes with building that up for the episode, let's go ahead and jump right into our top 5 behind the scene facts for this episode. So I can start us off today, and our first fact, pretty simple one, just talking about I had originally met Peyton, our actress who plays Iris, actually back in college. We met through a unique way. We weren't in any classes together or anything like that. She was actually an RA in my dorm that I was living in my senior year. And while she wasn't my RA, she was best friends with my RA. And so they did a lot of joint RA events together. So my roommates and I got to know her through that avenue. And as we were looking for somebody to fit the part of Iris, she just popped into my head, and she was gracious enough to be very excited about being involved in the production and was willing to jump on board for this.
I don't think I realized how, like, we were in the middle of filming. I was like, so how do you guys know each other? I was like, oh, she's my RA's friend. I was like, what? Because I was under the assumption that, like, you two were, like, good friends in college. Because, like, when she came to set, she was so happy. She was buddy-buddy with everybody. Like, made filming such a pleasure and such a fun time.
For sure. She was incredibly positive on set and was very generous to give as much time as she did. We ended up shooting for a total of 4 full days with her for this production. Her being willing to donate that time and being kind and energetic, and we really appreciate that. So definitely shout out to Peyton, and thank you for everything you did.
Because she was there on the hot days, too. In the storage unit. She had some of the worst filming days too.
For sure. 100%. And she also had a unique obstacle that no other actor that we had on set that brings us into your next fact.
Second fun fact, Peyton does not have blue eyes. She wore blue contacts for this role. This was also my first time ordering contact lenses from the UK.
We were initially thinking about getting an actress that was going to have blonde hair and blue eyes to fit the basic, not to use the word again, but canon of what her visual appearance is supposed to be. And so when we approached Peyton about it, we asked, hey, you don't have blue eyes. Would you be willing to wear blue contacts if we got them for you? And just as chipper as everything else she was doing on set, she said she was down to do it.
Yeah.
The rest is history there.
Absolute pleasure to work with. Cannot ask for an actor better than that.
For sure. Absolutely. Our third fact for this episode, talking about the locations that were used for filming in the flashback with the murder of Iris's boyfriend. Iris's apartment was actually shot in my old apartment that I was living in at the time that we were filming this production, and the apartment that her boyfriend was murdered in was shot in the kitchen of Faiz's old apartment.
We love finding free locations to film at, so naturally our apartments were going to be heavily used in some of our stuff.
We really wanted to have a diversity of locations to keep it as interesting as we could, and so we really pushed the bounds of every location that we had to shoot. And so being able to use both of our apartments at the time was definitely something that was important, a good asset. And honestly, it's just kind of nice to look back, and especially since neither of us are living in those apartments anymore, it's kind of fun to have that time capsule through the film of looking back where we used to live.
Yeah. I'm so glad I moved out, man.
Me too. I've got a much better apartment right now that I'm very happy with.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess moving into my fun facts, the Polaroid camera was actually the first prop purchased for the series and arrived on set March 27th of 2019. And each time the camera was snapped on screen, we had a behind-the-scenes Polaroid photo. The photo that I took was used for our Kickstarter purposes, so we saved it, we signed it, and we sent it out to people as a Kickstarter award.
So all of those photos that we sent out, I believe you actually had a file where you had done some scans, so we had those for our records, and we had thought that we had mailed out all the behind-the-scenes photos, and it's funny that we're recording this episode when we are, because it was just a week and a half ago now that I was going through some of my camera equipment, and I got to my drone box, and I found one Polaroid that we thought we had lost that was taken on set the day that we did the drone shot for episode 11. So that was funny to be able to find that, and we still have one that we held on to.
Yeah, it's great to have those. Something about Polaroid photos just being more tangible or something, they just feel really cool.
It is. It's a nice memory of some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that we were doing on set.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're listening and you were one of the Kickstarter backers that actually received one of our photos, drop us a comment on this video. We'd love to hear which one that you actually ended up receiving, and if you can identify what scene that photo was taken from. And for our fifth and final fact for this episode, the initial moving Polaroid photo effect seen in this episode is achieved with essentially a green screen effect in a Polaroid frame with additional masking to preserve the greenery of the nearby vines and leaves in the background. The second effect that you see when she is looking at the photo up on the wall in her apartment is actually achieved with the use of an iPad mini and masking for color grading to make it look less blue and stark to all of the orange light surrounding it. I definitely had a vision of how I wanted this to be edited, and so I did everything on the front end to make it as seamless as possible. And that's another example where planning really does help in the long run, because these effects, I really did think about them ahead of time, and they are not perfect, but they were as good as I could do them with the work I did on the front end.
Right, and it turned out pretty well.
Now that we've talked about a lot of the behind-the-scenes content for this episode, we want to take this opportunity to once again answer some questions and comments from our viewers. Our first and actually only comment today that we will be talking about is from bproductions_87 on YouTube, who writes, "The cloaked figure in Iris's backstory kind of resembles the cloaked figure in SCP-1981. Faaiz, I know that this series Making Declassified was really your introduction to the SCP universe, so I'm curious, are you familiar at all with SCP-1981?
I think you might have mentioned it, but I'm not sure exactly what SCP-1981 is.
So I'll give you a little bit of background and we can kind of fill our viewers in as well. SCP-1981, written by DigiWizard on the SCP Wiki, is an article about a home video Betamax tape recording of President Ronald Reagan, in which he makes references in his speech to future events that he couldn't possibly have known were going to happen at the time. And throughout the course of this interview, he also develops several severe wounds and lacerations on his face and body during the speech. Basically, I think it writes in the article that he continues to speak until his vocal cords are severed and the tape ends. So it's kind of a gruesome, weird, anomalous video. And the other anomalous component that they write about in the article is that on approximately 1 in every 7 viewings, there's a figure clothed in black robes with a conical hood that replaces a random member of Reagan's press detail and is standing in the background.
Interesting.
And so I think that's the cloaked figure that B Productions 87 is referring to here. That link here is completely unintentional. Any resemblance of the cloaked figures is not something that we had intended in production. But Faaiz, you mentioned that you remembered me saying something about SCP-1981 at one point, and there is an Easter egg in SCP Declassified referencing that. When you get to episode 11 in the series, you'll see Omar is going through a file cabinet containing some different SCPs, and if you pay attention to the specific labels on the filing cabinet, you can actually see SCP-1981 is housed in one of the other drawers.
Interesting.
So that was kind of an interesting link that wasn't intended here, but we did end up using the SCP later on in the series. So that was a interesting connection, B Productions 87, and we appreciate your comment.
I love it when people are like that into it and they can figure out even the Easter eggs we didn't plan on putting in there, they just found them.
For sure. No, it is interesting to see how viewing it through an outside lens can really draw other connections that maybe we didn't intend or didn't even think about at the time.
Absolutely.
That's going to wrap up questions and comments for this episode. If you have a question or comment based on the SCP Declassified series, please feel free to leave us a comment on our YouTube videos, and we will answer as many as we can and hopefully get back to you in a timely manner. But that's about going to do it for wrapping up this episode. I think all that's left to talk about is what are the main takeaways that we had in the production of making episode 4. We like to just go over a few learning points that might help some aspiring filmmakers out there that are interested in making productions like SCP Declassified. And so we want to share some of the lessons that we learned on set. So without further ado, Faaiz, what did you learn in the process that really stands out to you?
This isn't necessarily something I learned that was new. It was just something that reinforced something I knew even more. I remember, like, before we started filming, I was listening to a podcast called the Real Life Actor Podcast, and one thing he mentioned was, like, being happy on set, or just having some sort of positive energy on set, really helps everything move smoother and all that. And, I knew that, and we mentioned, hey, we need to be happy. If one of us is a little grumpy, be like, hey, you're being a little bit grumpy, like, bring it up just so you don't bring the whole production down. But there were some times just in that story, you were just miserable. It was just hot. And Peyton, not even for a second, was like complaining. She's just like, okay, like, let's go, let's do this. Like, I'm happy, I'm excited, I'm happy to be on set. And her being happy just made me happy. And then just Because, I mean, honestly, this, for the amount of time this took, you know, like we could have been really crabby. We could have had a lot worse performance. And for the way the performance would be this good, considering the amount of time it took and the temperature it took, I think shows that, like, if you're happy doing something, it will show in the project and the quality of it. And so just reinforcing that.
That's a really good point. And, you know, for these shoots, like you were saying, Peyton did bring a positive energy that I think really elevated the final product here. In other points in the series, there were different days where I was really down on one thing or you were really down on another. And I think it helped a lot that we were able to be there for each other at the lower points where I don't think we really had a point where both of us were low at the same time. And so we were able to kind of elevate each other and keep the momentum going, which is something that it almost sounds a little bit cheesy to say, but I think having that mindfulness and being able to reflect on that and seeing that as something that really propelled the series forward in a positive way is a really insightful thing to look at. So thank you for sharing that, Faaiz.
No, absolutely.
So I guess for me, mine is definitely going to be a more technical takeaway from this episode. In thinking about this from the perspective of both the director and editor, I think my main takeaway for this was the power of the edit for long dialogue scenes like this. We knew that we weren't going to be able to obviously get this entire conversation in one take. And so we did a lot of spot recordings of the individual lines.
Right.
And it was really important to be mindful of how this was going to fit in together on the back end. Try to film a lot of reaction shots for each of you as the other spoke of reactions towards your lines.
Right.
So we could cut in points where if we needed to cut a long line in the middle, we would have opportunities to splice a couple of different takes together. And I think being able to do that and have the foresight on the front end to overfilm everything gave me a lot of options in the edit that I think really allowed me to mask some difficulties that we had maybe with some of the longer stretches of audio.
Right.
And I think overall it really elevated the final product. And so for me, this episode really taught me how I need to think about editing dialogue scenes and how it's always important to overshoot rather than undershoot. So you have options in the edit that give you a lot of points to work around and give you options on the back end.
Would you say overshooting made things a little hard to manage when, I guess, in post, just because there's more volume of stuff for you to go through?
It definitely was longer to organize all the different files. It was longer for certain takes to watch all the different takes and the different angles that we had. And of course, on the production end, it took longer being on set to be able to film everything from multiple angles when we only had 2 cameras running. But I think if we had not done that and we had shot it differently, the final product would have suffered for it.
I agree.
So even though it was definitely more work on each end for production and post-production, it was something that if I had to do it over again, I would do it roughly the same way.
You mentioned how you'd have to scrub through and like look at the clips to figure out what you want. So I guess now is a great time to put in a plug to get a clapper. It is, I don't know, like you got it for Christmas. It is a cheap piece of plastic. You can write on it and you can clap, and it makes going through footage 10 times easier. Like, Ryan, how was your experience once you got, we didn't get a clapper for this production. We got it for a project we did after this. But, you know, I bet Ryan going through it, you tell me how was post with one of those?
Oh, it was so much faster on the other project because essentially when you have the clapper at the beginning and it tells you what shot and what take you're doing, if you take detailed notes while you're on set of what take is going to be the best, so easy to label the footage after the fact and to pull out the takes that you think are going to work best. It just wasn't something that was feasible for Declassified. But definitely big shout out to Amanda for getting me that clapper, because on all the projects going forward, I definitely plan to use it because it does make post-production so much easier for clip organization and selection. So highly recommend. It's not just for show. It serves a very practical purpose.
Absolutely.
But I think that about wraps it up for this episode. We'd like to thank everybody for listening in and joining us for talking about episode 3 of SCP Declassified. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate us on whatever podcast app you're listening on or give us a like on YouTube. And feel free to leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. And definitely, if you haven't already, please check out the SCP Declassified series and share with your friends. We're asking you to do a lot of different things, but we appreciate all of your support. And like we were saying in the last episode, podcasts live and die on the word of mouth. So we appreciate all of your support and in sharing the show. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will catch you on the next episode.
Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating. Peace.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Creator Consult. Whatever your creative passion, We hope you found some helpful tips and motivating words in this episode and enjoyed our conversation. Feel free to engage with us on social media. You can find the Creator Consult by Scruffy Chandelier Productions on X and Instagram at the Scruffy C. That's at THE_SCRUFFY_C at the Scruffy C. Join the Scruffy Chandelier Productions Discord server to join behind-the-scenes conversations for creators or regarding other Scruffy Chandelier Productions content. You can also join the conversation in the video comments on my YouTube channel. All the links can be found in the episode description below. Now get out there and learn, create, and enjoy your passions. And we'll see you in the next episode of the Creator Consult.